What makes this art and this not? In many ways, Halloween and Friday the 13th are the same. They have the same structure. An unknown killer, unknown even to the victims themselves, stalks through an otherwise quaint environment. He kills until leaving only one left, and this final survivor uses her ingenuity, and even her own terror, as a tool to win her survival. So that can't be the difference. Is it that one is scarier than the other? Halloween is definitely a scary film, with its villain Michael Myers creeping in the shadows, with the visage of a ghost and the planning of a predatory animal. It's more than enough to scare an audience. Friday the 13th also, with Henry Manfredini's ominous soundtrack and its first-person camera, plus the famous jump scare at its end. I mean, it was a huge hit for a reason, so that still can't explain it. I mean, all of that is scary. Another possibility is that one of them has a more identifiable, more iconic, and frankly, more interesting villain than the other. But not only does that not necessarily apply to other classic films in horror, which are often qualified as cinematic masterpieces, ones which have no identifiable villain at all, but it also doesn't explain why Friday the 13th sequels, which star Jason Voorhees, one of the most identifiable horror villains of all time, and almost the symbol of slasher films ever since, still doesn't have anything approaching that feel of artistry that Halloween does. Could it be the location then? No. Camp Crystal Lake is more than interesting enough. If anything, it's almost an inspired decision to place a slasher film in a summer camp, as it's familiar to the audience and contains a relatable creepiness to it. What about the directing and cinematography? Well, obviously Halloween has the edge there. It's not like Friday the 13th is incompetently made at all. In many regards, it excels. Its shot compositions and the visual language of its storytelling is very basic, but basic never means empty. On top of that, John Carpenter is one of the best horror directors of all time. Many horror films with directors of much less skill or craft, not that that's an insult, again, Carpenter is one of the best for a reason, still contain a depth to them, a sense that there's something being expressed to us deeper than the bare naked story we're seeing on screen. I know, it's the dialogue and the acting.
Lindsay! Lester's barking again and getting on my nerves again.
No, that's not it.
Never mind.
Fundamentally, there are two major things to consider when trying to parse this question, and a million minor things which I won't get into in this video. The first is writing, the second is direction. Generally speaking, depth in writing rarely comes from a place of conscious intention. Most writers will tell you this explicitly. Stories aren't something they create, they're something they sort of channel. Even when some degree of conscious planning is involved, let's say because they're writing to reach a niche in the market, they still find that the process of writing is like riding a wave. And the end product of any well done work, with all its consistencies in plot, tone, character, and theme, are more born from the necessity of keeping the whole thing in proportion than from any attempt to force these elements into place. This is one obvious area where we see Halloween excelling. Friday the 13th is not incompetently written in any regard. Its dialogue is believable and engaging enough. Its plot mostly makes sense, even if it fails at certain elements of setup and payoff. It has characters and it keeps their personalities consistent. All of these elements of its writing are fine. They're more than fine actually. But what causes them to fall short in terms of providing us with something more is that none of these elements come together in a way that adds up to anything more. In a usual movie, one like Halloween, its plot, characters, and tonal work is one, and the end product of that synergy is twofold. One, it gives the film an aesthetic identity, and two, it gives the film its themes. Themes aren't something which can just be sprinkled on top of a film, and thankfully, Friday the 13th, lacking any social or political ambition, doesn't even try to do this. But Halloween does have themes, and like all other great examples of writing, those themes are baked within the work itself. It's the plot, character, and tone which create the themes, and which are likely an expression of Carpenter's unconscious, even if he was able to consciously parse these themes after the fact. This is what gives Halloween its richness. Again, Friday the 13th doesn't fail here, but in its mad dash to fit together competent elements in order to make the script workable enough for filming, nothing in the movie feels part of any sort of cohesive artistic whole. All of the elements are there, but none of them mean anything. They're just excuses to give the audience the sex and violence which they're actually there for. This is good, as sex and violence are their own spectacle, but there's no larger spectacle here beyond that. Whereas Halloween, with comparable levels of sex and violence, is also somehow a movie about sex and violence, just like it's also a movie about fear, and a movie about evil. In terms of direction, I think the big difference here is again twofold. Halloween, first of all, is directed with more intentionality. In other words, the framing, camera work, blocking, etc. have all been decided on with an intent much more specific than just trying to figure out the best way to tell the story. Friday the 13th shows some style and craft. In the case of the first person perspective, this is just an attempt to capture the feel of Halloween, which is fair enough. Carpenter borrowed this technique from Bob Clark's Black Christmas, and in terms of many of the other directorial decisions, they're mostly done to set up scares. Outside of set pieces, the film is almost entirely devoid of directorial intentionality. Some of it is there, like the raining blood scene, but I'm like 95% certain that the effect here was unintentional. The second aspect of directing which elevates Halloween above Friday the 13th is in its specificity. Halloween can't be mistaken as a work by any other director other than Carpenter. Even with a million films trying to imitate it, and even though it was influenced by a dozen films itself, there's no mistaking Carpenter's style with anyone else's. He has a very efficient understanding of the forward thrust of storytelling, and, on top of that, his framing and blocking and how he combines it with a profound sense of lighting is again representative of his easily identifiable style. He's an encyclopedia of old Hollywood techniques reutilized for horror exploitation filmmaking. Not surprising for a man who grew up wanting to be the next John Ford or Howard Hawks. Friday the 13th completely lacks its own specific style or commitments to storytelling. When the camera is placed somewhere, it's because that placement gives a clean point of view of the action in question. There's some very good stuff here. As an example, making the window occupy a large part of the frame and then having a body thrown through it, or the slow zoom on Alice as she's resting on the canoe, for some reason, before Jason leaps from the water. Even the nature of that jump scare, which is the best part of the movie and probably what gave the franchise legs, as it made Jason more than just a plot device. Even the nature of it is gimmicky. It exists there without having any larger purpose other than to be scary. Anyways, that's my own 2 cents. Again, none of this is meant as an attack on Friday the 13th. I love those movies, much more than I love Halloween sequels, as an example. I wouldn't love them if there wasn't a lot to love in them, but I just thought the subject would be fun one to explore. It's one I've thought about a lot myself. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe. There is and will be many more just like it.